Warrick currently he began his aviation career in 2012. In 2016, he enrolled at PTC Aviation, where shortly after completing the bridging and type rating program, he then interviewed shortly thereafter and was accepted into Airlink with just over 300 hours of total time. Warrick now has over 3,000 hours of total time, and he's currently operating the 737-800 as a senior first officer at Mango. Now, Warrick, like I said, you're currently operating the 737-800, senior first officer for South African operator Mango Airlines, and now have over 1,300 hours on type. Where did this journey to the right-hand seat begin for you?
Sure, Dan. Well, there's a lot of probably be one or two cliches in the story, but for me, it was just, I can just remember as a youngster walking past CNA with my mom and going in there, and they had this World Aircraft file that you would buy. The 1 week you would get the file and the first sort of chapter, and then in subsequent weeks or months, I can't remember how it was, you would buy more and more and more of these and eventually have a full file. So I've actually still got that file to this day, and that's kind of what really piqued my interest and got me really interested in it. On top of that, the real cliche is obviously watching Top Gun. I remember my aunt recorded it for me on a good old VHS back in the day, and I watched it so many times. Eventually, the screen would just jump up and down because the tape had been damaged. So that was it. And then it was just very luckily I knew people who had some sort of involvement in aviation. No one in my family's flown. It was no one in airlines or anything like that until I went to until about grade 3 or 4, where I was actually friends and in the same class as Wayne Westerby's daughter. And she obviously told Wayne that there's this guy in my class and he loves aviation. And Wayne phoned my folks and said, well, look, I'm doing a 747-400 simulator session. I'm at SA over the weekend. If Warrick would like to come and have a look-see, he's more than welcome to. So there I was, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed as this youngster, was able to sit in the simulator for probably a good 4 hours, probably about 10 or 11, actually, about maybe 9 or 10. Had no idea what was going on, but just knew that this was something I wanted to do. And yeah, that's kind of from there, just the bug bit.
Awesome opportunity. And you then qualified, so you began your aviation career in 2012. What was that first position you got into industry shortly after completing your license? What were you doing at the time when you decided to enroll in this bridging training at PTC?
Yeah, well, it had been the sort of age-old problem that I had, certainly that we have in South Africa. I'd qualified with my, multi-engine instrument rating, had done that. Here you are. I'd written my ATP exams, and what next? I had done a bit of work at a charter company at Lanseria, so I'd met a few people. So at that stage, it was kind of what is the next step? And yeah, luckily for me, I enrolled. I'd flown the King Air for a little bit, for about 95 hours or so in that time. But I knew I needed to make that. I really wanted to get into the airlines. That was my goal from day one. And luckily enrolled in the what we called it back then, the airline pilot preparation program at PTC. And yeah, from there, that kind of really kickstarted my career.
Okay, so you enrolled into, as we said back then, it was called the APPP, or Airline Pilot Preparation Program, essentially a bridging program that's actually used in a lot of places around the world to prepare you for the type rating. You then completed the type rating on the 737-800. Now, at the time, you were working at ops, you filling the right-hand seat, getting a little bit of time on the King Air 200. What kind of was the motivation for you to leave that position and enroll in this program in Port Elizabeth?
Yeah. Well, a lot of people at the time when I did it sort of said to me, this was now, we're looking back at the sort of end of 2015 when I started inquiring to beginning of 2016 when I started. And a lot of people sort of looked at me and said, with the 737 type rating, because they only saw it as the type rating, they didn't see it as all the other skills I was going to learn in the process of getting this, doing this APPP course. So yeah, it was a great sort of opportunity for me to do, and luckily I kind of flying the King Air. It was lovely. I enjoyed it. I had some great experiences, but I always wanted to get in the airline, and I wanted to being a few years older than a lot of my friends because I'd gone to university. I wanted to get into the industry and try and get far into it as quick as possible. And I again called up Wayne Westerby. You know, he's been a mentor of mine, and met up. You know, he chatted to me, told me a few things about PTC. Met up with him when he was on a standby duty for New York up in Johannesburg. Had a long chat. He explained it to me, told me the ins and outs. You know, told me about how the industry's going, the way it's going. And the last two words he said to me that were the ones that kind of sold it to me, were just, I say sold it, sort of, should I say, made it me just realize this is what I need to do, was when Wayne just said to me, trust me. And I trusted him and did the course. And yeah, the rest is all history.
All right. So, you know, sometimes all it takes is just that connection, that one person that, you know, saying trust you, hey?
Yeah.
And you take that chance and it paid off for you. And let's touch more on that bridging program itself and that type rating. Now, you've already done type rating on the King at 200, relatively low time. You joined PTC with how many, or you rolled into the APPP with how many hours roughly?
Yeah, Dan, I started when I started the King at 200 rating, I had about 250 hours or just under, and then by the time I enrolled at PTC, I was about 340 hours total time in aircraft. Yeah.
Now, seeing as you'd already undergone a type rating process, how was the bridging training that you received here fundamentally different from what you experienced in the past? And how did it prepare you for what are the rigors of line operations?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, going into sort of general aviation, if you want to call it, doing a type rating, you know, in your typical charter operation, it's usually done in the sort of, you know, quickest time frame possible. Not too much focus on SOPs, you know, etc. You still operate the aircraft well. You're competent on the machine. You can operate it. You know, there's nothing saying you can't do that. The training is of a good level, but it doesn't cover as many bases as, you know, I would get from a course like the APPP. So when I did the APPP course, you know, I had a bit of experience on the King Air, but it was more operational in terms of, you know, ATC communications and all that. Moving on to the 737, you know, I would say someone could do that from multi-engine piston, doing a 737 rating, if it's done through the correct channels, and you've been trained as a low time pilot, and you expect it to perform in that way, you can do it quite comfortably.
Okay, so take us through the course. What did it entail, and what were the critical elements that you gained from this to help prepare you for your time at the next step, which was Link?
Yeah, well, so obviously one of the biggest things is just the way the course was presented to me. It was just, you know, everything I wanted. It was, you know, on an iPad, electronic platforms, access to materials, and everything was, you know, structured in such a nice way. I knew exactly what I was doing. So by having that done, you're already, you know, really getting into the sort of, I want to say, the vibe of training and the culture. And then obviously doing the course, being exposed to elements of ops, basically getting you ready to operate in the right-hand seat of a you know, medium-range jet aircraft in scheduled operations. That's the goal of the course. And so we covered things like RVSM, MMPS, ETOPS or EDTO. We did, you know, obviously a big emphasis on high-speed flight and the characteristics of a swept-wing, you know, jet aircraft at high altitudes. All those things which you don't typically get exposed to. And then on top of that, one of the biggest things where I think I learned the most from, because essentially when you fly in an aircraft of that size in a scheduled airline operation, it's about managing situations. So by doing line flights as part of your training in the simulator with captains who are currently flying that aircraft for for different airlines or for airlines, or even who are flying different types but are still current on that, and learning from them and seeing how they operate. Now, you as this young sort of first officer are just sitting there and just taking in all this information and seeing how they handle things, seeing how things work. And it's just an amazing experience. So by the time I left, you know, being exposed to doing operational flight plans, making fuel decisions, Part 121, you know, planning minima, all those aspects that we covered, you know, I felt more than ready to go into the right-hand seat of an airliner.
Okay, so you underwent the bridging program, you learned all those elements, you completed a type rating on the 737-800. Now, bridging training is something that's being introduced into the South African market at the moment. Now, given your previous exposure prior to that process that you underwent, prior to actually completing the type rating, would you have readily been able to climb into, or would you have readily been able to complete a type rating on a swept wing medium transport jet such as the 737-800? Or was that bridging training really key to helping you achieve that transition from, King Air 200 to heavy or medium commercial transport jet?
Yeah, I think so, Dan, because if you look at, let's say you take a straight up rating where it's X amount of hours and there's nothing else in there except for you attend it, you do ground school, you do simulator, you do a skills test in a simulator, and you're done. And you've a lot of it is left up to you and to work on your previous knowledge, which you as a 200-hour pilot don't have. You don't have much operational experience. So by being exposed to all the other concepts that pilots with 3,000-4,000 hours or even 2,000 hours might have, by learning those concepts in a slow and structured way and integrating them, building on each session onto each session onto each session, that makes you, by the time you get to the skills test side, you feel confident in your ability to operate the aircraft. So without that, just doing, let's say, a hit and run sort of type rating, I don't think with low time you would be, I think you would probably pass it, but it would be a bit more stressful and you might not get as much out of the training, which is actually what you want to do.
All right, so you might pass the type rating. What about when you hit the line?
Yeah, well, that's the big thing. So, you could have a license sheet with 100 different aircraft type on it and no operational experience. And that's where I think the cracks will start to show, because on the line, it's very different to a simulator. You've got distractions, you've got things happening, you've got non-normal events, shorter ATC routings. A lot of things if you are not on top of the airplane, can become big things, very quickly, and you can find yourself falling behind the aircraft, which is obviously not what you want to do. And things do happen quickly in a jet aircraft. So, by learning things like even simple tasks like operational flight plans and, how to fill those in, how to make fuel decisions, how to work out, just small things like ETAs and revised ETAs and, all that, and know where it fits into the cycle of the aircraft setup. So from your pre-flight briefings, to your, where's sterile cockpit, descent, threat and error management, all these things. If you just do a type rating straight up, you're probably not going to know a lot of the stuff, which is going to come out at you on your first day of line training, let's say, and you're going to be sitting in this airplane and completely overwhelmed by the environment around you with people knocking on the door, signing for fuel slips. You really need to be able to focus on the airplane. And if you've got the knowledge on the operational side, already, if you've got a good understanding of that, you'll have so much more RAM, and available headspace to fly the airplane.
All right, so that type rating is merely there just to teach you specifically about the aircraft system, as it were, not really to prepare you for, what happens out there on the line.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so you completed the bridging program, you underwent all these programs and qualifications, you completed the type rating. You enrolled in January of 2016. By May of 2016, you were afforded the opportunity to interview at Airlink with, must have been at that stage, about 340 hours, round about there.
Yeah, I had about 340 hours, yeah. It was the same as when I joined PTC, essentially.
So it's probably one of the lowest time guys that have ever presented, in front of the interview board. Can you just take us through the interview process at Airlink and explain how that process, that bridging training, all those knowledge and skills that you obtained helped prepare you for the various elements of the interview?
Yeah, well, so the process at Airlink, the first step was, very luckily, obviously, being invited for the interview. I was completely blown away by that. And that was purely because I had done the course at PTC and the management pilots from Airlink came to look at the PTC facility, and I was asked to sort of do a demo on the simulator, just showing them, because I was one of the first students to do the APPP. So just by luck and being in the right place at the right time, I did a mini sort of loft in the simulator, and afterwards I was advised that they would like me to, like you said, present for an interview. So obviously then I was just, I couldn't stop. I was just grinning from ear to ear, because that's what it's about. It doesn't matter that it's going to be onto an ERJ versus a 737. Your goal is to get into that airline and get your first job. So, and that was unbelievable. So the first step was obviously they sort of not the typical sort of way it would have gone, but they saw me do the flight in the simulator first, even though it's a different simulator to the ERJ. But I then had to go to Airlink and write a technical exam, which obviously covered a lot of sort of technical aspects, ATPL knowledge, things along those lines. And luckily, obviously, again, I'd been exposed to a lot of different things that I hadn't really learned too much about. So questions on hung starts and hot starts, all those things, I might not have, if I'd only flown a piston, I might not have been too clued up on what those were. So at least I had practical experience of understanding what those were. So obviously going through the technical exam. So I wrote the technical exam. I believe it's online now, but when I was there, it was a handwritten exam. Past that, then was invited to an interview a couple of days later. So that's obviously the big one now, is the interview, and that was in front of fleet captains, head of training, director of flight ops. Quite a stressful interview. But I had got so many good resources from my time at PTC. So I had manuals on high-speed flight, on RNAV operations. I had so much to pull from, and then obviously I also had all the instructors at PTC who I was able to lean on, if I did need to find anything out. So that really prepared me for that side of it. Obviously, you never know how an interview is going to go, but you can only do your best. And if you're prepared as best you can, then it's up. You can only do as best you can. So I did that. Luckily, was successful in that interview, and then was advised probably, I think, later that day that I was successful, and then I needed to come back for the psychometric assessments, which I then did. And I did the psychometric assessment. Again, there was a couple of hours in the morning. Past that, luckily, was successful. And then the typical step from there that everyone else on my course followed was to go and do a simulator assessment on the ERJ at Denell at OR Tambo. But because that they had seen me fly the simulator at PTC, even though it was on a 737, it was more about operating the airplane. And they said, well, I think they thought they've seen me do it, so they were happy to pass me on that. And then I was given a job offer a couple of days later. So it all happened very quickly. And before I could, wipe the sleep out of my eyes, I was sitting on day one of ground school.
Wow, that's quite a journey to that point.
Yeah.
It doesn't end there. Hey? Immediately after that, ground school for the ERJ, and then shortly after simulator training on simulator training for the 135 145. What was that process like?
Yeah, that was really enjoyable. Obviously, ground school, now you're learning a whole new aircraft, just freshly after learning the 737 and passing the skills test in that. So it was a mind shift to then get onto the ERJ and the Embraer sort of way of thinking. Did the ground school, got into the simulator training. By then, obviously already having done a jet type rating, really was really beneficial to me. All my course mates had flown large turboprop aircraft, so they were much more experienced than I was. But I'd say having the jet, even though I'd only done a type rating and I hadn't flown the 737, just having done that rating and all that I'd learned, even in terms of sort of event management at Mango, that carried through, and it really made the type rating at Airlink really enjoyable.
Okay, so that helped a lot, I'm sure. Like you said, having some initial kind of jet exposure or exposure to jet training helped you get through the 135 and 145 type rating. Now, guys, before I continue, for those of you watching, anybody wanting to ask Warrick a question, we've got a few more questions left, but please feel free to draft it during the next couple of minutes that we continue this discussion, just so we can bring it up towards the end. Now, Warrick, you've done the type rating, second jet type rating in the space of 6 months, so quite a busy period for you.
It was.
I'm pretty sure not a lot of people can say that they did that, particularly with 300 hours. Now, how long from when you completed the type rating to how long did it take for you to actually get on the line right-hand seat of an Embraer, and how was that initial operator experience for you?
All right, so you're talking about from the type rating of the Embraer onto line training, is that correct?
Line training.
Yeah, so at that stage, Airlink was rapidly expanding. So I actually finished my type rating relatively quickly. We didn't have CBT for ground school there, so we still did it, sat down in a classroom. So it took 2 weeks as opposed to 3 or 4. I actually don't know how long it takes. So let's say a week. So that took a bit longer, but it was very in depth and really, really good to get some really good knowledge of the aircraft. We then got into the simulator. We started with CPT training, doing all the procedures and learning the flows and the SOPs. And then we got into the simulator, and that was about 2 weeks of sim training. I forget how many sessions, but I think roughly, including the skills test, about 40 hours maybe in the sim. And that's obviously swapping with your sim partner left, right seat the whole time, because we both were doing initial ratings. Then the unfortunate thing was when I finished my type rating, I remember it was a Friday, and I was only scheduled for my first line training flight in 2 weeks' time, because there was such expansion at Airlink at the time, and there weren't enough training captains actually to train us all. So it kind of just went down the list of seniority of who joined when they started. So obviously me being with lowest time, I was sort of at the bottom of the list. So about 2 weeks, but 2 weeks after the type rating, I was sitting there in the right-hand seat. I remember at Tambo, sitting on the runway, thinking to myself, I'm sitting on 03 left in Johannesburg in an ERJ with 37 passengers in the back. And I'm about to go to Mozambique, flying up to Tet for the day, and then coming back and then doing a Gaborone and back. And I couldn't believe I was going to log my first jet hours that day. Unbelievable experience.
So let's touch on the jet, and then let's touch on the experience, because you mentioned those two elements. So your training was heavily centered on the 737-800 for a couple of months. You went to the type rating, 135, 145. Were the skills obtained during your training on the 737, your initial jet exposure, were they readily transferable to the Embraer 135, or was it completely different to what you had experienced before? Because you did mention you had to get into the Embraer mindset.
Yeah, so that was obviously just, and I think all aircraft manufacturers have a sort of mindset or a way they've sort of designed the aircraft, but in terms of the skills being transferable, the platform itself, which is the airplane, whether that's Embraer or an Airbus or a Boeing, they all fly the same way, essentially. It's just how things are done that is different. So having the platform change is a part of it, but having the skills to understand, high speed flight, autopilot, FMCs, all those things that happen, whether you're on an ERJ or a 737 or an Airbus, even though they all differ slightly, they all do essentially the same job. Obviously, some have more features than others, etc. But having those skills in the background and the time that was built up doing the APPP course at PTC, being able to take that across to the Embraer, I felt there were already things when I got there that I was like, oh yes, I've seen this before, even though it's in a different airplane. I understand what this thing's telling me, or maybe you just feel one step ahead, which is great. Obviously, there's some things you can't cover for every eventuality, but overall, flying the airplane is flying the airplane. That's the same. The big part is the operational environment. So having that background in understanding how OFPs and CETAs work, fuel planning, as I said, I'm harping on about it, but the Part 121 sort of mindset. If you can take that mindset across, you can fit into any operation.
Okay, so you, in terms of handling the jet, you said it was, jet's a jet, and you had that exposure. You touched on a few operational elements, you mentioned, making a fuel decision, operational flight plan. Did you have a very clear idea of what that initial line exposure was going to be like in your head already, or was it almost a bit of a shock?
I think by then you're just raring to go. You've done all this extensive training, and now it's coming to fruition. You're sitting in the jet and are going to be going on your first flight and advancing the thrust levers for the first time. So that's a massive part of it. But yeah, Dan, I felt that I was ready to go. What was in my mind was just obviously all the procedures you've learned, all the CRM, all the MCC. Everything I'd learned, I was like, okay, now I need to put this into practice, because this is for real now. Now I'm sitting on the tarmac about to go. That was really the big thing. But in terms of the day, it went well. I think as well as day one of sort of initial operating experience can go. And it was, in some ways, it was easier than I expected. In some ways, it was adapting to the environment is probably the biggest thing, because now you're sitting there for the first time, dealing with ramp agents, dealing with cabin crew, not simulated cabin crew. Everything's happening as you see it. You've got fuel slips, you've got fuel trucks, you've got baggage handlers. That you can prepare yourself for only so much. But the actual flying part and operational side, I think I was really well prepared for that with the training I'd undergone.
So, tell me, Warrick, how long were you at Airlink for?
I was at Airlink just under 2 years.
Okay,
sorry, Dan?
Sorry, so you're at Airlink for 2 years, and thereafter you joined Mango.
Yeah, I joined Mango, and I joined Mango in June 2018, and I've been here ever since.
So it was quite a period of about 2 years from where you had that initial exposure on the 737. You had a lot of exposure on the 135, 145. How was it going back onto the 737-800 platform? Once again, jet, a little bit heavier. How did that experience, that whole journey from PTC through to Airlink, prepare you for the operational experience at Mango, or was it very much similar to what you experienced previously?
Yeah, well, obviously, like you say, it was a quite a big time gap between flying the 737 again, which I'd obviously only done in the simulator. So by the time it got to getting back into the seat, I can actually remember at my Mango simulator session, sort of getting into the right-hand seat, and I hadn't sat in it since I did my type rating, thinking this is very different to the Embraer, which I've been sitting in almost daily for 2 years, So that was quite a big thing to sit there and go, okay, I just need to try and remember where everything is here. And because I'm type rated, there's added pressure on me now because, I'm type rated, I should know, everything. And so that was quite stressful. But once I started flying the aircraft again and going through everything, I think it had been so reinforced in me in terms of SOPs and how everything works on the 737 that once I started training, it actually really came back to me quite quickly, which was a great relief and also really, really cool to see.
Did you have to redo the type rating process again, or were you on an accelerated program considering you already held the type rating?
Yeah, luckily I was on an accelerated program. So my program consisted of doing some reactivation training, which I came down to PTC to do. Which Mango outsourced. So I did five simulator sessions at PTC, and that was, with the focus on being on the Mango normal procedures, the SOPs, and getting myself sort of ready to transition to that. I then went to the simulator at SAA, the one that Mango uses, and I did 2 sessions there, which were just some sort of handling circuits, getting myself familiar in that regard. And then it was on to line training about 2 days after that. So that also happened really quickly.
Now, just one more question, Warrick, before we go to the Q&A session of the discussion. There are people out there that want to be in the position you are, operating a 737-800, that I'm sure are going to listen to your journey. And do you have any advice for people entering into the industry right now, or that may already be within industry, that have just completed their training, To help give them the best chance of success as we head towards recovery in the aviation industry?
Yeah, well, I think it's the first thing is, even though we've got a lot of doom and gloom stories around the world at the moment, regarding aviation, obviously being a sector that's been severely hit over the last sort of year and a half or so, is to, Wayne alluded to it when he did his talk on the figures for the sort of projected outlooks on pilots for the coming years. And the reality is those will happen, and people are going to need pilots. So starting now is a great time, as opposed to saying, why should I do it now when there's no jobs now? But the reality is it's going to take you a year or two to qualify. And by that time, you want to be ready to, to have your foot in the door. So that's the one part of it, is not thinking that it's all done and aviation is finished, because it certainly isn't. And then the other thing, I think what's really important is you've got to make yourself as marketable as you can. And by that, I mean, if you can sort of upskill yourself in any way, do it. If it means writing your, you've got some spare time, study, write your ATPs, or if it's networking with people, if it's walking around, trying to just any way you can be involved in aviation and meet people and try and make yourself as marketable, be the best, version of yourself, essentially. And you've got to make yourself stand out from others, because at the end of the day, if there's 3,000 guys, applying for a job and they're only going to take 100, you need to make sure you're in the top 100. And so it's very easy to sort of, just sort of be average, but always try and be above average.
Okay, well, Warrick, I've got three questions actually for you.
Sure.
One is from Michael. Michael asks, would you rather do a modular course or an integrated course in 2021 with all the job losses due to the current pandemic?
All right, Dan, well, quickly, you're going to excuse my ignorance, just to confirm, because I didn't do an integrated, or I think I did modular. Can you just refresh my memory on the difference between the two?
Modular course is the conventional route that one follows, where you do PPL, night rating, commercial exam, and then instrument rating. Integrated course streamlines that process, where you would, for example, write your airline pilot transport license exams without having to write the PPL and CPL exams, and then it's everything that we would otherwise do modular is integrated into various lessons of increasing complexity. And you actually qualify with less than additional 200 hours. I think it's 180 hours at the moment after the school that is offering it. So yeah, that's the question there is based on that.
Okay, cool.
Modular or integrated?
Yeah, thanks. I thought it was something along those lines, but I just wanted to make 100% certain. Yeah, so I obviously did the modular. I did the modular route where I did it, sort of build on. I guess it all depends on, it's never too soon to be qualified. So if an integrated is going to get it done quicker and you have the financial means to do that, then it's probably a great way to do it. And also, I think these days with the integrated courses, things are really getting geared towards airline ops, sort of like we've seen in Europe, where, you go from zero to airline competent. That's kind of the route. You train from day one as an airline pilot, and that is a really good way to do it. So in that regard, integrated is probably really good. If you can't do that, if you have to do it, bit by bit, then modular is also great to do. But in terms of, with regarding all the job losses, they're going to come back, those jobs. So if you qualify now, or 6 months after that, let's say, if you do it modular, I wouldn't say there's too much of a difference. I think it just comes down to what someone is comfortable with and what someone can sort of what someone can afford to do at the time.
Absolutely, but like you said, those jobs will come back. We see it's coming back in the States already. They're talking about a shortage that is present.
Definitely.
And, people aren't going to take ships. They're going to fly planes to get to where they need to go to. And like you said, if you want to grab that opportunity, you can catch that wave when it comes. Best prepare yourself as best you can. Now, Tanashi's asked, what did you find the most challenging part of the APPP program, the Airline Pilot Preparation Program?
Okay, well, I would probably say one of the, and I say most challenging, but maybe the ones that was the biggest sort of things I had to focus on is the sort of mindset change in doing that. When you step into a multi-crew aircraft, whether that be an ERJ or a 737, it's how to work as a crew. Now, obviously, in general aviation, there's some guys who do that really well, and there's some guys who have flown, single crew their whole life. So when you kind of sitting there, it's more to fill the seat. So really knowing how to work as a team, and the CRM element, I think is massive. Luckily, I'd flown King Airs with fairly sophisticated sort of automation. So the automation side of things was pretty good, but I didn't find the coursework, I didn't find there was an overload when I did the APPP. I would say probably one of the biggest things was to think as a team, as opposed to thinking as a single pilot.
So you touched on CRM. Could you expand a bit on MCC and multi-crew cooperation elements for those that might not completely understand what that's all about and how it's different from, say, the single pilot ops experience at an initial level?
Yeah, well, obviously, when it comes to MCC, and we're now working in a team environment. So we're not sitting just with myself flying a little single engine piston. We're working as a team. We've got to achieve a mission. So it's how to work together in that team and always do things as safely as possible. So obviously there's the 4 golden rules, which I can't recite offhand now, but we've got the 4 rules of MCC, and basically to enhance safety, work together, and what is appropriate behavior in the aircraft. So are we in an appropriate sort of configuration for the phase of flight? Is it appropriate if I turn your heading bug when you're pilot flying? All those sorts of elements come into it.
So it's just pure integration, how you and someone you may never have met before take a 737-800 from Joburg to Cape Town in a safe and efficient way.
Absolutely, that's it. Standardizing the whole sort of procedure.
Now, Frederick Null asked quite an interesting question. Are there any habits that you would encourage a young student pilot to develop from the start that might help them going forward and moving on to airline operations?
Yeah, well, there's lots of good habits. One of the things, I still do it to this day, is I go onto YouTube and I search sort of Just Planes or any of those sort of, those companies that make sort of the films on the flights, and I watch those. And even as someone, I don't have, compared to a lot of the guys watching there, I don't have a lot of experience, but to be able to even just learn, you see guys flying A350 1000s, across the Atlantic, and just learning as much as you can, even though it might not be applicable to you now. You never know when one day you're going to need to sort of reach back into the back of your mind and say, oh, I remember, watching guys do this. It could be in an interview. It could be on line training somewhere one day where someone asks you a question. I think the best thing is to always just have a habit of learning. And guys will tell you, guys who've been in the industry for 30, 40 years, that, you never stop learning in this industry. So just keep on learning. And the best thing is to do, if you want to become an airline pilot, which I assume, Frederick does from his message, then absolutely be in that mindset from day one. Doesn't mean don't enjoy your training when you sit in that seat for the first time on your, your first introduction flight to when you, finishing or doing your solos. Always think of it in a professional way, in a safe way, and try and take what you can see professional pilots doing into your environment, even if it's just, flying in a Cessna 172.
Now, Sanashi asked again, had you not gotten the invitation to Airlink, what was your game plan in terms of career progression?
Yeah, so that's a very, very good question there, Sanashi. So at that stage, I still very fortunately had contact with the people I was flying the King Air for. So it would have been a case of probably continuing my career on the King Air, and until such a stage that I had the required hours in order to, to get an invite into an airline like Airlink, in those stages. It could have been anything. Obviously, at that stage, there were still cadet schemes. Cathay Pacific had cadet schemes. There were a lot of programs going around. So it was basically just to see what I could get. And, I'd obviously been following those programs for a long time anyway. But luckily, this came along, and I didn't have to think too much about, which I was very, very fortunate, to be in that position. But I would have put my head down. I would have continued, doing as much as I could, and just trying to work. I might have tried to see if I could go on contract to get some hours, get the hours up quickly. But luckily for me, it worked out. It worked out quickly, and before I knew it, I was at Airlink.
Brilliant. And Warrick, I think those are all the questions we have for today, but I just want to say thanks very, very much again for sharing your time, your journey with us. And we wish you all the best for the coming year.
Yeah, thanks very much, Dan. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
To everybody else watching, I hope you've enjoyed that chat from Warrick Trotter. Keep an eye out on our social media for our next guest speaker. Our next speaker will be Captain Bruce Hyde. He's the current head of training at Mango Airlines. He'll be chatting to us about what he looks for when interviewing a candidate for his operator, as well as covering frequently asked questions that most have regarding the interview process. We'll see you the same time next week. Until then, keep safe, everyone.